Let's talk about one of the most used ways of communicating to God that we typically use, and that is asking. Christ, when he was about to be crucified, he instructed his disciples in the upper room about things that would involve the new relationship that was about to come as a result of his death for sins and his resurrection 3 days later. Within these instructions, he tells them, if perhaps they ask in his name, he will do it for them. And you see this over in John chapter 14 and verse 14, where it says, if perhaps you ask me something in my name, I will do it. Now, further on in the conversation, in John chapter 15, he explains this a little bit more in the aspect of the new relationship that we as Christians are going to have with God, and especially in how we abide with him. Over in John chapter 15 and verse 7, he expands on this and he says, if you abide in me and my utterances abide in you. Now, that concept of utterance there, I know that a lot of our translations say word, but he's talking about a very specific statement. He's not talking about everything he said, but he's referring to specifically what he's telling the disciples at this point, that if they ask, he will actually give it to them, that if they abide in him, they can actually grow and mature in their relationship with God. And you see that at the beginning of John chapter 15. So here he says, if you abide in me and my utterances abide in you, that which if perhaps you desire, you will ask and it will come to be for you. So we have a promise from God that has to do with asking him. And we are to ask for ourselves to God. But we need to understand properly how to communicate with God in asking. Because when it comes to, oftentimes we ask for things and we don't get them. Why is that? We don't get them because we're asking wrong. It's not that there's a certain pattern that we have to ask the Father to get something. It's the intent of our hearts that ultimately is what's stopping us from getting what we're asking for. Because the reality is, we're asking to consume it of our own pleasures. We're not asking to fulfill the desirous will of God. And we see this, of course, over in James chapter 4 and verse 3, where it says, you all ask and you do not receive because you ask from wrong, in order that you in your pleasures may consume it. It's asking God as if he's some magical genie to give us everything that our heart desires, but not paying any attention to who we are in Christ. Remember over in John chapter 15 and verse 7, Christ told the disciples, if you abide in me and my word abides in you, then whatsoever you ask, I will give it to you. When we are guarding his commandments, that is not just keeping them, but protecting them, showing that there's something of value. And by the way, he's not talking about the 10 commandments. What are the commandments for a Christian? Believe on the Son, Jesus Christ, abide in Christ, and love one another. These are our commandments, and these are what he's talking about as far as his utterances. If those abide in us, then whatsoever we ask, he will actually give it to us. So when we are guarding his commandments and living a life that manifests his character, that is Christ in us, whatsoever we ask, he will give it to us. And that which perhaps we should ask, we will receive from him because we guard his commandments and we do the things well-pleasing before him. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 22. And this, of course, is a confidence that we have, that if he hears us, we are going to receive what we asked. 1 John chapter 5 and verse 14 talks about that. And it specifically says, and this is a confidence which we have facing him, that if perhaps we should ask something according to his desirous will, he hears us. And if perhaps we intuitively know that he hears us, that which if perhaps we should ask, we intuitively know that we have the thing asked which we asked facing him. 1 John chapter 5 and verse 15. So when it comes down to asking, are we asking according to God's will? A lot of times when we make a request before God or when we ask, It can be for somebody who is sick to be healed, or somebody who's having difficulties. Although that's a slightly different way of communicating, oftentimes we will ask that they're healed. But the reality is that God's will for them? Perhaps through that sickness, they can glorify God more than if they were actually better. And yeah, I know that's a little difficult for us to understand. But the reality is, as a Christian, we do not need to have a healthy body to glorify God. We can glorify God in our life, and we can glorify God in our death. Don't ask God expecting to consume it of your own desires, to fulfill the desires of your flesh. Focus on who you are in Christ. Begin to use the mind that God has so graciously given to us, where we can actually receive the things of God and they make sense to us. Because when we're focusing on that and we're using that mind, we're able to discern situations. We're able to look at it and see what truly would be the will of God in this situation. And when we see it, we should ask. Because when we do, God very clearly states, He will do that which we ask.